So, Dwight Eisenhower was inaugurated in January of 1953, and as we already saw, he was the president who brought an end to the fighting in the Korean War. And he did that by apparently threatening the use of the atomic bomb. We will never know if he actually would have done it because the Chinese did not call his bluff. And the fighting ended, although the war still to this day has not been officially ended with a peace treaty. The two sides, the North and the South Koreans, they've been talking, but there's still no official peace treaty. But we're going to take a closer look at the broad brushstrokes of the Eisenhower foreign policy and some of the crises that he had to deal with in his 8 years as president, none of which led the United States into going to war. Eisenhower had promised when he was running for president there would be no more Koreas, and he stuck to that promise. So, first thing, Eisenhower said he was rejecting the goal of containment. Now, you might be saying, wait a minute, you mean he wants communism to spread? No, the opposite. Eisenhower, and more especially his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, said that containment is accepting communism, being willing to live with communism where it exists. And they stated, those two men stated that the United States was going to look for opportunities to push back the domain of communism if the chance arose. No more Koreas meant no more long drawn-out ground wars in this era of Cold War. Eisenhower said that he was going to make use of something he called brinkmanship, that in a foreign policy crisis, the United States would use its best advantage, which was a large nuclear arsenal, to force its opponents to the brink of nuclear war. And they would, in his estimation, always back down. And that's how we were going to conduct things, through brinkmanship. Might sound a little scary, but he was convinced that this would be the way to go. It would also be the way to save money, because we could spend less money on conventional troops, which had to be trained, housed, fed, clothed, given medical care, and retirement, and instead just build nuclear weapons. More bang for the buck is what they called it back then. Obviously, there would be some situations where the threat of nuclear war made no difference, when there were internal issues that we had to deal with. And so there was going to be a stepped up operational role for the CIA that we will talk about in a second. So, to convince our enemies that we were, yes, indeed, preparing to go to the brink of nuclear war, we started doing what it took to prepare our society for nuclear war, including having children practice duck and cover drills. Now, my duck and cover drills did not look like that. The school that I went to when I was that age was brand new. It was, a school built for, the baby boom generation. And it had reinforced walls in the hallways. So we did not duck under our desks because, it was a little bit too close to the outside windows. We went into the hallway where we assumed that position, but it was out in the hallway. The United States government also started distributing these little pamphlets on how to build a fallout shelter, a bomb shelter. 1962 was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. A lot of these pamphlets were purchased, including by my cousins. Their family had a bomb shelter in the basement of their house. And when we visited them, the kids used to go downstairs and play nuclear war in a fully equipped bomb shelter with all kinds of supplies, medical supplies, canned food. And we just thought, hey, this is fun. Let's play nuclear war. Eisenhower was the president who got Congress to pass the appropriations to begin building. It wasn't completed until, I think, the 1990s. The interstate highway system, of which the New York State Thruway is a part. Interstate 90 runs from Boston to Seattle and right by Rochester. So one of the questions on the sheet you're filling out is, what did this have to do with our foreign policy? It obviously has a lot to do with, the growth of the suburbs. We'll talk about that later, commerce, things like that. But foreign policy, think about that. See if you can figure it out. The first place where the CIA practiced its new role, operational, was in the nation of Iran. The prime minister of Iran, a guy by the name of Mossadegh, who had been elected through their parliamentary democratic system, was someone we were a little bit concerned about. He was nationalizing the oil industry, taking the oil fields away from British Petroleum. He wasn't a communist, but he wasn't cracking down on the Iranian communists, which was a concern to us. And so in 1953, our CIA got in touch with the opposition forces to Mossadegh and participated in his overthrow, bringing back the man who had been deposed as the leader of Iran, the Shah, who was a king. So yes, our CIA was involved in an operation that overthrew an elected prime minister and restored a king in the nation of Iran. Now this was 1953, and here we are in 2020, and ask yourselves, what is the relationship between the United States and Iran? And ask yourselves, why is it so bad? And one of the big reasons it's so bad is right there, something that happened 70 years ago. The next year, 1954, a similar situation in Guatemala with similar results and similar involvement of the CIA. 1954 also saw a crisis for France in their colony of Indochina, where communist guerrillas under a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh were on the brink of defeating the French. And they had surrounded a French military outpost at a place called Dien Bien Phu, and it looked like that outpost was going to be either wiped out or, they were going to have to surrender. The French asked for our help, and Eisenhower did not want to get involved in rescuing the French from this mess that they were in a place that eventually Americans would come to know as Vietnam. And so in the spring of '54, the French got out of there. They surrendered that military outpost, and they negotiated with the Vietnamese communists to turn Vietnam temporarily into two sectors, a northern part, which was run by the Vietnamese communists, and a southern part, which was run by a man that the French handpicked to run a non-communist part of Vietnam. He was a Vietnamese, but he was brought up in French schools in Vietnam. He was a Roman Catholic, and he hated communism. And the plan was that after 2 years, Vietnam was going to have reunification elections, and the people of Vietnam were going to be able to choose with which path, communism or non-communism, they wanted to go. Obviously, we were not interested in seeing all of Vietnam become communist, and so we began aiding the leader of non-communist South Vietnam. Obviously, more about that later. Things started heating up in the Middle East as nations began to assert their independence, and no more so than Egypt. And the president of Egypt there, he's the man waving his arms in the left-hand part of that photograph, Nasser, announced that he was going to take over the Suez Canal, which runs through his country, and use the proceeds from the fees for the canal to build a hydroelectric power plant and dam on the Nile River at a place called Aswan. Now, taking over the canal meant that he would be taking it away from the two nations that had built it, France and England. They were not too pleased. And in 1956, under the ruse of intervening in the war between Egypt and Israel, a nation that had been born in 1948, France and England sent paratroopers into the Suez Zone. The entire world reacted against them, including both the Soviet Union and the United States. So yes, the United States took the side of the Soviet Union in this crisis, not two of its NATO allies. And so you look at that date, 1956, and ask yourselves, and I think, again, it's a question on that sheet, exactly why would the United States have taken the side of the Arab world in 1956? The same week as the Suez Crisis, Hungary exploded. Hungary was one of those countries that had been occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. Had been a communist country ever since then. But in 1956, anti-communist elements in Hungary rose up and attempted to overthrow their communist government. Unsuccessfully. The Soviet Union, through their military into Hungary, crushed the rebellion. And so the question is, why, if the United States had proclaimed when Eisenhower was running for president that we were going to look for opportunities to push back the rule of communism, why did we not intervene in this anti-communist rebellion in Hungary? It was a weird week. In the Middle East, we were siding with the Soviet Union. In Hungary, we sat by while this anti-communist rebellion was crushed. 1957, the big event in the Cold War was when the Soviet Union launched the world's first man-made satellite, Sputnik. And this surprised us. And we reacted in so many different ways, on so many different levels. We created new education programs because we apparently were slipping behind the Soviets in math and science. But there was real concern about the nuclear arms race. So ask yourselves, why would this event, the Soviet Union putting a satellite into orbit, have created a lot of fear inside the United States about the direction of the arms race? One of the reactions of our government was to create our space program, NASA. And that emerged in 1958. The next big event was to pick some astronauts to start putting men into outer space. And this was part of the Cold War. It was not just scientific research, although I imagine most of the people who work for NASA were, just interested in the science. But this was also about prestige in the world, and we could not let the communist world, we could not let the Soviet Union just outdistance us in outer space. There was too much of our ego wrapped up in this. Okay, so there we went off into space. The CIA unveiled a new operation in the late 1950s, intended to gather information on the Soviet Union, especially its weapons programs, and that was the U-2 spy plane program, which was pretty successful for a long time until, shockingly, in 1960, they did shoot one down. Caused an international crisis because they shot it down over the Soviet Union. But Eisenhower never backed away from his claim that in this era of the Cold War, we had the right and indeed the obligation to fly these planes over our enemy in order to gather the information that we needed. Last big event of the 50s was when Fidel Castro completed his successful revolution in Cuba, overthrowing a very repressive autocratic leader by the name of Batista. And at first the United States was, I don't know, we were sort of intrigued by this guy, the beard and smoking the cigars and walking around in his army suit and always talking about, helping out the people of Cuba. Sounds good. Until he gets invited to Moscow to pose for pictures with his new best buddy, the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev. And so, that meant he had to go, okay, because Cuba, 90 miles away, cannot have a communist leader down there. So Eisenhower went back to the CIA and told them that in light of their successful operations in Iran and Guatemala, get something going for Cuba.